In this video, we'll look at macro-level survey design. Macro-level survey design is applicable whenever you want to survey a very large area, so tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of square kilometers. The basic idea with macro-level survey design is that when we're sampling a very large area, we've got no hope of covering it with camera traps. So we break down the design decision into two steps. In the first step, we look at the whole survey area, like the entire snow leopard range here, and we decide on some initial survey regions. These are places where we're going to go and place camera trap arrays. So in this area, it's basically like choosing where we're going to put these red dots. Each of these red dots is thousands of square kilometers. And so if we blow up this red dot, we'd have a region that looks something like this. So a second level decision is within each of these survey regions where we're going to put our camera traps. That's the micro level survey design decision. This video is about macro level survey design. So just to reiterate, with macro level survey design, we've got a large survey area, and our basic decision is where we're going to go and put camera trap arrays, rather than individual camera traps. And the idea here is that although we might have here a 6x6 camera trap array, in terms of the overall survey area, the area that array covers is tiny. And so basically what we're choosing is where across this whole area we're going to put our camera trap arrays. Why is this important? Why do we need a macro level design decision? Well, basically this comes down to whether we're going to do model-based or design-based inference. If we're going to do model-based inference, we know from previous videos that all that we need to do is cover both high and low values of the covariates. This assumes that density has a relationship to some covariates and that relationship is constant throughout the survey region. As you work with bigger and bigger survey areas, these assumptions become less tenable. So for example, over the whole snow leopard range, there's probably not a single relationship between a covariate like terrain ruggedness and snow leopard density. And that makes model-based inference much more difficult. So when you're looking at a macro level, design-based inference might be the only option. And again, we know from previous videos that if we're going to do design-based inference, we need to be very careful that the sites that we select in a survey area are representative of that broader region. So for example, if I've chosen those 5 sites, not by any randomization, but just because I think that they look representative, someone might come along and say, hang on, there's a road that passes close to all of these survey sites. And so these sites aren't representative of the region as a whole. And they might propose another set of 5 sites as more representative. And the third person might come along and say, well, these are all close, or 4 out of the 5 sites are close to the border of the survey region. And that's not representative. And so we can go around in circles about arguing which sites are more representative. Randomization helps avoid these arguments. Another reason to use a macro level survey design is to exploit something that happens commonly with spatial processes. And that's that observations that are close together tend to be more closely related than 2 observations that are separated far in space. So we actually saw this in a previous video where we were trying to estimate the total number of animals across 51 fields. Here there was a strong relationship between horizontal distance and the number of animals present. So as we move from left to right, we get more animals. And patterns like this are pretty common with spatial processes. Also in that video, we looked at how we could use simple random sampling to build an estimate of the total number of animals. But if we're choosing sites totally at random, it's quite common to get 2 or 3 sites that are close together in space. And that's relatively inefficient because the values at these sites will tend to be correlated, and this inflates the variance of our final estimates. So this happens here, where we see 2 pairs of fields that are close together in space. And that'll happen quite often with completely random sampling. So one of the things that we can do to decrease the variance of our estimates is to space our samples apart in space. We still need some randomization, but we can do that by choosing a random starting field. So here I've chosen this 4th field as a random start, and then I've spread out the other fields that we sample, at some constant interval. We can go through the same calculations as before and come up with an estimate of how many animals there are. We can choose a different random start and get a different answer, but here typically the variation in this estimate will be lower because we're using these constantly spaced intervals, and so we're guaranteed to sample space relatively evenly. So this is all in one dimension, but these principles extend naturally over to two dimensions. So imagine that we're sampling this large two-dimensional area. The first thing we could do is to chop it up into grid cells. And then if we were doing simple random sampling, this would just involve choosing a fixed number of these cells completely at random. If we wanted to use the procedure on the previous slide and spread our samples out spatially, in two dimensions, this would be like putting down a grid. Grids are a really good way of achieving evenly spread samples through space, but they have two drawbacks. The first is that they need you to specify how many points you have up front, and this isn't always possible for snow leopard surveys. So for example, here we've got 9 surveys, but if we wanted to add another 9, it's not clear how we would do that while maintaining spatial balance. The second drawback is that they work best for fairly regular survey areas. So if you've got a very irregularly shaped survey area, it might be difficult or impossible to put down a grid. So Halton points, which is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the video, are a way of trying to maintain a spatially well-balanced sample while avoiding these two drawbacks. The basic idea is to generate a sequence of points so that at any stage when you stop, the sample is well-balanced. If you add further points, the sample remains well-balanced. To get a bit of insight into what Halton points are, let's look at a simple case where you just have one dimension. So imagine you have an interval 0 to 1. The first Halton point splits this interval in half. So the first Halton point is a half. We've then got two intervals, 0 to a half and a half to 1. The next two Halton points split each of these intervals into a half. We've now got 4 intervals, 0 to a quarter to a half to 3/4, and 3/4 to 1. The next 4 Halton points sequentially split each of these intervals into halves. You'll see that if we stop the sequence at any stage, we'd have a pretty well-balanced sample spatially. Things work exactly the same way in two dimensions. So here I've shown the first 12 Halton points. The first 6 points are in red and the next 6 points are in blue. Notice that there's a pattern here. So we start by generating a point in this cell, then we move up into this cell, and then the third point is in this cell. And then the next 3 points kind of oppose that pattern, or have an opposite pattern. So here's the 4th point, then the 5th point, and then the 6th point. So there's this characteristic, a V on its side, and then a V on its other side pattern. So after 6 points, if you just sort of squint and look at the red points, you'll see that they're reasonably well balanced spatially. The next 6 points have that same pattern. So the 7th point is here, the 8th point is here, the 9th point is here. So there's that V pattern. And the next 3 points, there's the 10th, 11th, and 12th points. So again, if you squint and look at the blue points, they're pretty well balanced spatially. Now, if you combine the 2 points, if you look at the first 12 points in total, they're also pretty well balanced spatially. And this is a key property of Halton points, that no matter what sequence of points we look at, we've got a good, those points have good spatial balance. So the first 6 points, the next 6 points, the 6 points after that, those will all be reasonably well balanced. So that's really important because it allows us to randomize our sample. No matter where we start, so we can start from the first Halton point, the 12th Halton point, the 1000th Halton point. However many points we generate after that are going to be spatially well balanced. So it allows us to introduce some randomization into our survey design, which, as we've seen, is critical for design-based inference. The second thing is that you don't need to know in advance how many surveys you can do. No matter how many surveys you end up doing, the points will remain spatially well balanced. Just to illustrate those points, here's another set of Halton points generated from a starting point of 902. You'll see here the red points are again well balanced, the blue points are again well balanced, and the combination of the two of them are again well balanced. Similarly, here are the first 100 Halton points, the first 50 in blue and the next 50 in red. Here again you can see the good spatial balance. There are two really neat things about Halton points. The first is that it can handle very irregularly shaped survey areas. So say, for example, that we couldn't do any surveys in this red area. For some reason it was out of bounds. All that we would do is, if any Halton points are generated in this area, we would just ignore them and move on to the next point in the sequence. We could do this with a highly irregular survey area. The second thing that can handle is stratification. So say, for example, that this blue area was a low density area and the green area is a high density area, and we wanted to put more effort into the green area. What we can do is to generate halting points in the usual way, and then when we've hit the required number in this blue area, we can just reject any further ones that are added to this area, while keeping the ones that are added to this green area until we've got the required number in both areas. So halting points can very easily handle highly irregular survey areas as well as stratification, and they also have the benefit that you don't need to specify how many surveys you're going to run up front. So when should you use halting points? Well, to start with, let's just look at a few examples when they're not needed. So one place where they're not needed is when you've got very few arrays that can cover most of the survey area. So if you're just going to put down 2 or 3 arrays, you don't need to go to all the effort of using halting points. If you're going to use model-based inference, then what you're saying is density varies as a function of some covariate, and it's important to capture both high and low values of that covariate, but you don't need halting points to do that. And thirdly, if you know how many surveys you want to do in advance, then you can usually use a grid design unless you've got a very irregularly shaped survey area. So halting points are most appropriate when you've got a very large survey area that you can't cover even with a moderate number of camera trap arrays, where you've got no covariate information, or you can't assume that density varies as a function of covariates, of some covariate in the same way across the whole space, and when you don't know how many camera trap arrays you're going to be able to use. So when you're not sure of your survey efforts in advance. In that case, halting points give you a way of iteratively putting down camera trap arrays in a way that maintains good spatial balance. So just to summarize, when you're designing very large SCR surveys, you need 2 steps. Firstly, you need to decide where in the overall survey area you're going to sample. So you're going to choose survey regions within the broader survey area. That's the macro level design decision. And then within each of these survey regions, which might be thousands of square kilometers themselves, you want to decide where you're going to put the cameras. That's the micro level design decision. When you've got a very large survey area, you've got no chance of covering it exhaustively. So your only chance is to choose representative sample survey areas and then extrapolate to the broader area. Because points that are close together in space tend to be similar, designs that are well spatially balanced tend to be relatively efficient with low variance. So this means that you should use a grid design if it's possible, or a design based on halting points if grids are not possible. In the next video, we'll look at an app that will generate halting points, and so it can help you with some of these macro level design decisions.